Okay, so get ready for a deep dive. Because today we're tackling a period in Japan's history that often gets overshadowed by the whole economic miracle story.
You mean the Edo period?
Yeah.
It's often seen as this like closed-off pre-modern era, but our source makes a really compelling case that it was actually crucial for Japan's later economic success.
Yeah, see, I always thought of it as Japan being kind of stuck in time before the Meiji Restoration, but it sounds like there's a lot more to it. So what was going on in the Edo period that made such a big impact?
Well, they call it translative adaptation, this idea that Edo Japan was laying the groundwork.
Translative adaptation. Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
Essentially, it's like Edo Japan was this startup, right?
Mm.
Fine-tuning its internal operations before launching this like killer product on the global stage.
Yeah. Okay, I like that analogy. So instead of being stuck in the Dark Ages, Edo Japan was building a unique set of strength. What were some of those advantages, the ones that maybe set them apart from other countries that faced this disruptive encounter with the West?
Well, for one thing, literacy. By the mid-1800s, Japan had literacy rates that were rivaling some developed nations, thanks in part to their Terracotta school system.
Really? Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so a significant chunk of the population was already primed for absorbing knowledge, which is obviously a huge advantage when it comes to adopting new technologies and ideas.
It's like they were unknowingly prepping for a future they couldn't even imagine.
Exactly, and it wasn't just literacy. Edo Japan also saw this big shift from subsistence farming to more commercial agriculture. They were producing surpluses, engaging with market forces, stuff that a lot of developing nations today still really struggle with.
Right, like figuring out how to feed a growing population, deal with urbanization.
Yeah, all without a playbook. In fact, our source draws some pretty interesting parallels between the economic hurdles of Edo Japan and the challenges that rapidly developing nations face even today.
So they were wrestling with really complex issues, just in a totally different context.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the flourishing domestic trade routes, specialized manufacturing. They even had local governments promoting certain industries. The Edo period was a hive of economic activity.
It's like a totally different picture than the isolated backwater we often imagine.
Right? It really flips the script. Edo Japan was a society grappling with a lot of the same economic issues as a modern developing economy, just in a different way.
Which makes you realize there are multiple paths to development, not just this one Western model.
Absolutely, and that's key to understanding how they reacted when the West did finally show up with its ships and tech.
Because they were ready to not just adopt, but adapt.
Precisely. It wasn't starting from scratch. They had this foundation to build on.
This whole translative adaptation thing is really blowing my mind. It changes how I see Japan's modernization. They weren't just copying the West, they were integrating those new ideas into an already complex system.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Meiji transformation so fascinating. It's this collision of two very different worlds, but Japan was more prepared than anyone realized.
Okay, I am ready to dive into the Meiji era, but that sounds like a story for another part of our deep dive. Okay, so we left off with Japan basically getting this crash course in Western technology and realizing they need to catch up fast. I imagine that must have been a pretty intense time. Like, how do you even begin to wrap your head around that kind of challenge?
Oh, absolutely. And our source really captures this sense of urgency, this catch up at all costs mentality that took hold during the Meiji era. They knew if they didn't modernize and quickly, they risked being, swallowed up by these Western powers.
Right, becoming another colony, yeah. But modernization isn't exactly a one-size-fits-all kind of deal, is it? Like, where do you even begin?
And that's what's so fascinating. The source talks about this three-pronged approach they took.
Mm.
Rapid industrialization, obviously, but also political reform and, get this, external expansion.
External expansion. So they were trying to, beat the West at their own game.
Well, it was more nuanced than that. They saw what was happening, right? These Western powers carving up the world. And they realized that to avoid becoming someone else's conquest, they had to assert themselves on the global stage.
It's like that classic dilemma, join them or be conquered, right? But juggling all those things at once, industrializing, reforming their government, building up their military, that's like next level multitasking.
Totally. And our source talks about these constant internal struggles. Like on the political front, there were these huge debates about what model to follow. Should they adopt a British-style parliament or a more centralized system like Germany?
Wow, talk about competing visions for the future. I wonder if those kinds of debates ever really go away completely.
Right. And then there's the whole balancing act of industrial growth and the let's say, allure, but also eventual consequences of military expansion. Japan definitely wasn't immune to that tension.
It makes you wonder how much of that period was just reacting to these external pressures versus like proactively shaping their own destiny.
That's a key question, and it's something that scholars are still debating today.
Hmm.
But speaking of internal struggles, the source mentions this really fascinating dilemma that the writer Natsume Soseki brought up. He wrote about this tension Japan was facing between, like, embracing westernization on one hand and preserving its own cultural identity on the other.
It's like this microcosm of what so many countries are still grappling with today, right? How do you become modern, technologically advanced, but also stay true to your roots?
Absolutely, and it's a question without easy answers.
Yeah.
But in terms of their economic development, it makes you wonder, how did they approach all this new technology? Did they just try to import everything from the West?
Yeah, was it like a copy paste situation?
Initially, there was a lot of that,
Yeah.
bringing in foreign advisors, importing machinery, the whole deal.
Mm.
But, and this is where that translative adaptation idea comes back in, they didn't stop there. The source talks about this remarkable shift where they went from importing expertise to actually cultivating their own.
Oh, like instead of just buying the fish, they learned to fish themselves.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes this point that they weren't content with simply using Western tech. They wanted to understand it, improve upon it, make it their own.
It reminds me of those stories about the quote unquote disloyal craftsmen they had back then, these skilled workers who would basically job hop between factories, soaking up knowledge and techniques, and then use that experience to start their own businesses.
Yeah, like the original startup ninjas.
Yeah.
And here's the really interesting part. Instead of punishing that kind of disloyalty, the government often encouraged it. They recognized that this entrepreneurial spirit, this drive to learn and improve, was essential for driving innovation and growth.
That's such an important point. They created this culture where, like, learning and sharing knowledge, even if it meant leaving your current company, was seen as a positive thing.
And it speaks to this idea that economic growth isn't just about, like, top-down policies. It's also about fostering the right kind of bottom-up energy and creativity.
Totally. It makes you wonder how much faster things move when you create that kind of environment. But all of this rapid development, all this change, it wasn't without its hiccups, right? I mean, the 20th century threw some pretty major curveballs Japan's way.
Oh, absolutely. Wars, earthquakes, financial crises, you name it, they dealt with it.
So last time we were talking about how Japan was really hitting its stride with modernization, but the 20th century had some other plans, right? I mean, talk about a wild ride, wars, earthquakes, economic ups and downs.
Yeah, it really highlights how unpredictable economic progress can be. It's not this straight line upwards. It's more like, a roller coaster with some crazy loops thrown in.
And Japan experienced more than its fair share of those loops, it seems like.
They really did. But what's amazing is how they navigated those challenges, how they adapted and ultimately emerged as this economic powerhouse.
Right, because for a while there, they were like the envy of the world. So how did they go from rebuilding after the war to becoming this global economic force?
Yeah.
Well, there were a lot of factors, obviously. Our source talks about the role of U.S. aid in the post-war years, the focus on education and technology transfer. Plus, they benefited from a pretty favorable global economic climate. But there were also some uniquely Japanese strengths that played a huge role.
Okay, so spill the tea. What were these secret ingredients?
Well, remember that concept of rationalization we talked about earlier? This emphasis on efficiency, eliminating waste? That became a core principle in their manufacturing.
So it wasn't just about working hard, it was about working smarter. Exactly. And they took this even further with the Kaizen movement, this idea of continuous improvement, making small changes over time to increase quality and efficiency. It's about creating a culture of learning and innovation at every level.
So it was as much about mindset as it was about technology or, government policies.
Absolutely. And this wasn't limited to individual companies. Remember the supporting industries we discussed. This network of small and medium-sized businesses, they were crucial too.
Because it created this whole ecosystem, right? Big corporations working hand in hand with these smaller, more specialized firms.
Exactly. And don't forget the cultural element. Our source talks about this idea of monozukuri, which basically translates to the art and spirit of manufacturing. It's this deeply ingrained value system that prizes craftsmanship, quality, the pursuit of perfection.
So they combined that Western efficiency with this very Japanese sense of pride in their work.
Precisely. And for a while there, this formula, it seemed unstoppable. Japan was leading the charge in electronics, automobiles, all these key industries. But as we know, No economic miracle lasts forever, right?
Right, because then the 1970s rolled around and things started to shift.
Exactly. The 1973 oil crisis was a real wake-up call. It exposed just how vulnerable their economy was to these external shocks, especially their dependence on imported oil.
And I imagine that as other Asian economies started to rise, the competition got a lot fiercer too.
Oh, absolutely. And then Japan entered this period that economists often call the lost decade.
The 1990s, right. I remember learning about that. What exactly happened there? Did their model just stop working?
Well, it was a combination of factors. Remember those close ties between corporations and banks? The emphasis on lifetime employment. Those things, while great for stability, ended up making the system really resistant to change.
It's like they were so good at doing things a certain way that they weren't prepared when the rules of the game changed.
Exactly. And that rigidity led to a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Bad debt, slowing innovation, a reluctance to really embrace new technologies and industries.
So it wasn't so much that their model was wrong, it's that the world around them changed and they didn't adapt fast enough.
That's a really good way to put it. And I think that's a lesson for any nation, any economy, really.
It's like that saying, what got you here won't get you there.
Exactly. And, Japan has been grappling with these challenges ever since. They've tried different policies with varying degrees of success. It's been a long road to recovery.
Which makes you think, right? What is the path forward for a country like Japan? Can they find a new model for success in this globalized, constantly changing world? Or do they need to go back to the drawing board?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, I don't think anyone has the definitive answer. But I think by studying their story, both the successes and the struggles, we can gain some valuable insights.
Totally. Because ultimately, it's a very human story. It's about resilience, adaptability, the constant pursuit of progress. And those are things that we can all relate to, no matter where we live or what we do.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we've done our part to unpack this fascinating chapter in economic history. Thanks for diving deep with us.